Hey there! Welcome back to another headset review. This time we're going to be looking at what's basically the little brother of this thing on my head right now, the Crystal Light from Pimax. The Crystal Light is, as the name implies, a cut-down version of the original Crystal here. There are a couple major and somewhat minor but still meaningful changes between these two headsets though, so let's dive right into examining this thing right here, and if it's worth it. Starting with the most significant selling point, the clarity and the lenses. We're going to start with the positives and then the negatives. But a quick disclaimer, I was sent the Crystal Light for free as a review unit, but if you've seen how scathing some of my coverage has been of things I've gotten for free before, including stuff from Pimax, you should know that's not going to affect my opinion very much, but it's still worth bringing up. That out of the way, I did already cover the original Crystal's incredible clarity and exhaustive detail in my original review, things like the manufacturing specs of the screens, the pros and cons of the lenses, local dimming, all that good stuff. So if you want a super thorough look at those aspects alongside a bunch of citations, you can watch that video from the following timestamp, because the Crystal Light, it's basically identical to its older brother when it comes to the lenses, screens, and local dimming. But if you don't want to, as that is a long segment of a long video, I'm still going to provide a quick overview here before we get to the significant differences. You're welcome to skip to the lenses and local dimming timestamp if you're already familiar with the clarity though, as I do have some new comments on that part. Starting with the good! The Crystal Light boasts the same 35 ppd lenses with a 2880 by 2880 resolution, and this makes for an incredibly sharp image, which is beginning to approach things like 1080p monitors at normal size and average viewing distances. I have a large 43-inch 4K monitor, and yes, it's unquestionably a good bit sharper, make no mistake. But having used headsets all over the spectrum on pixel density besides this one, from the original HTC Vive to the Index to the Quest 3, the kind of clarity I get here is good enough. I don't feel like there's a need to seriously temper someone's expectations if they see my desktop mirror versus putting on the headset themselves. It may not be as good, but it's still not a huge downgrade. Things like screen door effect are basically non-existent. You might see the absolute faintest little bit when looking directly up the sky or if you're actively trying to find it in certain scenes, but you'd still need very critical eyes, and I bet many people would struggle to see it even if they tried. The overall image is just really good and clear, but there are a few issues like the small sweet spot and chromatic aberration. More on that in the lenses section shortly. The colors on this also just feel so much more rich and vibrant in comparison to every other LCD headset I've used out there. And these can absolutely stand up to any OLED VR headset that I have used. Its color gamut is a wide 100% NTSC. And I own a PSVR 2, which greatly disappointed me, but I still have it, so I can make that comparison. If you're fond of great colors, I don't think you're going to be let down here coming from an OLED panel. Not quite there, but it's real close. But particularly when it comes to OLED comparisons, color gamut is only one part of the equation. Contrast ratio is also very important. So it's time to talk about the local dimming, because there's a lot more to say here, and I've got some more thoughts on it since having tried the PSVR 2. And since you can, hopefully soon, buy a version of the light without it to save money, I think it's worth covering this in more detail to decide if the extra cost is worth it for you. To briefly explain local dimming, imagine that this big grid here has each box represent a single pixel. OLED is capable of adjusting its brightness on a per pixel level, so every pixel here can be as bright or dim as it needs to be. If you need something like, say, a couple squares up here to be brightly lit, but the rest all black, well, you can do that. A typical LCD backlight without local dimming, however, can't do this, and you have the entire backlight that'll dim or brighten itself at once, which is what leads to those gray blacks, as one corner is pure black, but another can be much brighter. Then tough luck, it has to figure out how to do both at the same time compared to OLED. But this is where local dimming enters as sort of a middle ground. A typical local dimming setup will have zones of pixels you can adjust. The more zones you have, the finer control that you have over the individual pixels. You could have only a handful of zones, so your control is limited to big squares like this, or then you don't benefit as much. Or you could have numerous zones like this, where even if it's not per pixel, you can still have pretty granular control control due to how many zones can be adjusted. The crystal itself has 572 zones per eye, which may sound like a lot, but then you have to remember that this is spread across 8.3 million pixels per eye. In theory, local dimming would let you get the best of both display technologies. In practice, well, it's not so simple. Pimax has a slider value which lets you control and adjust your local dimming value in real time, going from 0 to 1, and it can be adjusted to the thousandth decimal place. So you get a lot of control here. 0 means that the local dimming is entirely turned off, while 1 is the most aggressive setting, which gets you the deepest blacks, as some zones just turn off entirely. But because it's not a per pixel level dimming, you sometimes get blooming or sort of like a halo outline on darker scenes, because the precision of the local dimming is limited by the number of zones. Unfortunately, I can't demonstrate this in a recording, as it is a physical panel limitation, and through the lens does a poor job of portraying it. So here's a mock-up to kind of illustrate how it can look. How bad this is entirely depends on the game and scene. Best case instances where even maxed out things looking good with minimal to no blooming are things like where there is only 1 or 2 notable light sources in the dark, such as this dark hallway in Saints and Sinners with a flashlight. Alternatively, when you have lots of bright sources which take up a large portion of the screen, but still covering most of the dark areas, such as when I'm standing out on the moon in Space Engine looking at the numerous stars of the universe from within our galaxy. In those cases, this absolutely can go blow for blow with OLED contrast ratio. I have done side-by-sides with the PSVR 2 just to be certain, but these are best case scenarios. The problem with the local dimming is that when it fails, it really fails. In the same game I just praised, Space Engine, if I go to another spot like outside of the Milky Way and into intergalactic space to look around, this is terrible on 1.0 because the majority of the environment is meant to be pure black, but with a few small lights breaking it up in numerous areas. The blooming in an environment like this is incredibly distracting. It's like having a constant white flickering over nearly the whole screen. At least to me, I find it worse than a more uniform gray-black because the constant flickering is very, very distracting. But this is where the slider comes in, as while they still let the pixels dim themselves by zones, they clamp the ability to turn off completely, sacrificing some contrast ratio for image uniformity, and the blooming just goes away. If you set the value to something like 0.995 or 0.999, while there definitely is a measurable difference between 1.0, you can still get deep blacks that feel much closer to OLED than normal LCD, but the blooming is gone. It's not quite there on raw blacks, but considering the current options and their limits, it's so close I actually prefer the crystal in darker scenes to the PSVR 2, because of the lack of any glare or mirror like it has quite commonly there. Those things can let it be more competitive than the raw numbers would imply. I would recommend everyone try this fix with this in mind. I'd also strongly recommend the local dimming version over the non-LD one if you play anything that has dark scenes with regularity, though it's not as much of a benefit if you're playing stuff in very bright areas. One disclaimer though, the local dimming does affect the brightness of the screen because certain elements are meant to be darker instead of all just very brightly lit with a uniform back panel. If you see a pure white screen, the brightness at least felt the same. Local dimming just gives you the extra dynamic range between white and black. But this can be aggressive given the zone limitations, and since you're not looking at pure white screens normally, this means the image does tend to be a little bit darker. I don't have the tools to measure exactly the impacted numbers, unfortunately, though, so if somebody has and wants to bring it up in the comments, please do so. But this is something I've also noticed on my HDR 1000 monitor with HDR mode. Some stuff is brighter in SDR because it's just blasting the full brightness. I mentioned the lenses just now as part of why the contrast ratio can feel so good. This is where we start having some asterisks, or things aren't all fantastic. So the lenses on the light are glass aspheric lenses, which are removable. See? So if somebody says the clarity on the light is better because of the fixed lenses, stop listening to them. I also talked about this in depth on my OG Crystal review, so I'll be brief here because there are a few more notes and important things I want to cover. The sweet spot on these is tiny. When I say sweet spot, I refer to how easy it is to get your eyes in the right spot to have the exact perfect clarity. If you're not in that exact little spot, you're liable to see things like chromatic aberration, here's an example if you don't know what that is, getting worse, and notable geometric distortions. I get very minimal to none of both of these, save maybe the absolute furthest edges, but if I intentionally set the IPD wrong, it gets very bad. When you're in the sweet spot, though, the edge-to-edge clarity on these is just phenomenal. If you've used a Quest 3, on this aspect, it's not quite on par, but I find it very close. The far edges do start degrading somewhat, but with the crystal, it's so easy to just move your eyes around almost the whole FOV instead of moving the headset when you want to read something. Unfortunately, the lack of built-in eye tracking doesn't really help with how finicky the lenses are. I've been using the original crystal for around a year and a half and used about a dozen VR headsets at this rate, so I got a good idea of what my IPD is and have long since figured out exactly what to use on this optical stack. But if you're planning on the light as, say, your first headset, I could definitely see some issues getting the sweet spot right, possibly even being a deal breaker, because compared to old gen HMDs like the Quest 2 or the Index, which use Fresnel lenses, the visual artifacts when looking straight ahead without moving when the IPD is off aren't as obvious because everything is simply so clear. If you haven't or can't get your IPD properly measured, I would very, very strongly recommend using some apps like Glasses On to try and figure out your IPD. Don't just feel it out if you're not experienced with VR headsets. The Crystal Light is a temperamental beast here, but they are still my personal favorite lenses. I do also want to say that I've seen some in the community mention visual issues that they ended up needing to have the lenses swapped out for, so I don't know if perhaps Pimax just had a bad batch or it is general QC issues, but if you have some problems that just won't get fixed, I'd advise trying to reseat the lenses and get in touch with Pimax support. But I also want to say that some people just have issues with spheric lenses in general. As compared to things like Fresnel lenses, they tend to be more prone to issues like pupil swim and those geometric distortions. So be mindful of your return policy timer just in case you are one of those people. Consider waiting to order on somewhere like Amazon if that is a huge concern for you. You can do software IPD adjustments in the Pimax client to get a perfectly dialed in headset if you truly want to. So it's an option, but I think most people will prefer to leave this alone. And for the last section concerning the visuals, there's the FOV. I'm going to make this short. It's the exact same as the original crystal. No difference when using the same face pad, so we can move on now, right? No. Because Pimax advertises 115 horizontal and 105 vertical. Now, the vertical, if you use Test HMD, can come out to about 102, 104, but Test HMD does not account for the fact that the crystal has a bias towards seeing more FOV looking down than it does up, but Test HMD is still standard, and that's close, so I'll let the vertical pass. But in case someone's going to say, oh, your face shape might be bad, so you could just get more FOV with a better face shape. The answer is no! At least if you're using a reliable measuring method. Using the HMDQ tool, which grabs the physically rendered values the headset itself reports to applications to render, we come out to these values, which are the same as the original crystal. The vertical isn't quite right, because the crystal uses canted displays and a technique called parallel projections to get around this. The Index does it too. I'll link the blog post by Risa 2000 explaining it in more detail, but basically that slightly messes with the vertical value. But point is, the headset physically renders only 103 horizontal. The reason stuff like Test HMD and WIM-FOV may be slightly larger is, to make a long story short, due to how they measure stuff in relation to the head pose and being in front of you. So if you're like within a few degrees, you're still fine. There's a little wiggle room depending on exactly how you measure, but there is no legitimate way you're getting close to 115 degrees, at least that all the other reviewers use. And if somebody says they do, stop listening to them. I've had some of the largest measurements I've seen with the crystal via standard tools, so I would assume I'm at about the max and I have an ideal face shape for this headset. But just in case you're worried that this has less FOV than the OG crystal, because Pimax advertised that as 125, oh boy, I had a lot to say there. It's the same. Not as bad of a lie, but it is still an exaggeration. Okay, so now let's get into the more significant differences that go beyond just the visuals. Namely the audio quality, as this is one area which is quite the big difference from the OG. Hang on a moment. I think I'm catching a bit of a cold. Let me fix that. There we go. Much better. So, what you just heard there is the microphone on the Crystal Light. I've been using the original Crystal microphone for this entire review and just briefly switched over to the Light. The only adjustment I made was with the volume slider in Windows, as I peak every mic I've used on the default volume, and that's a very simple thing I think is fair to adjust versus, say, external programs with a lot of tweaks. You probably heard quite the difference in audio quality there. This is one spot where the original Crystal just beats the absolute hell out of the Light. It's definitely better than the Xbox 360 era gamer mic quality stuff like the HTC Vive used, but what about the headphones, huh? We have two things to talk about here. This is the default S-Mass I have right here, and then there's the optional D-Mass upgrade. The S-Mass, it's kind of weird. The actual audio quality is okay. It's not great. It's not awful. I'd say it kind of feels a little worse than the Quest 2 or Quest 3, kinda. When you can hear it, even at 100% volume, this thing is quiet. I'm somebody who has to run virtually every pair of headphones I bought at like 20 to 40% volume. This is the only time I have ever wanted to turn something up past 100%, as given the off-ear nature of these, it being so quiet is a huge issue. Take something like Project Wingman, for instance. I can be playing around in that, and the rumble of the plane's engines at high speed during fights is just not there. It's too quiet for me to hear and just sort of takes me out of the immersion. I only hear it when literally nothing else is going on. Considering that the higher end headsets tend to sacrifice audio, which I do think makes sense as it's more easily fixed, it's nice to at least have a present audio solution as a complete package, but if it could just be like 20% louder, then it'd be so much better, and I think the budget-minded could even live with it. As is, it is so close to decent, but it's barely above usable right now, and overall falls a good bit short of the quest line for this sole reason. But this is where the D-Mass comes in, which I have on the Light right now here. Audio quality-wise, it just feels exactly as good as it did on the original Crystal. It's a top-tier VR audio solution. I'm not a big audio guy, nor do I have good equipment for testing things, so I'm not gonna pretend I can talk about in-depth with good data to support my point. But I've used things like the Index, and I own a pair of Odyssey Maxwell headphones, and the D-Mass is just stellar, and I don't feel like I'm missing anything from those. Now, I might even say some stuff sounds a little better in the D-Mass than my Maxwells. If audio is a big deal, these are worth every penny of that $100 cost. If you choose to get the Light without local dimming, put the savings toward these. You won't regret it. And now we get to comfort. This is going to be a lot more subjective as it can depend heavily on your face shape. Things that people have said are perfectly comfortable, like the Index, were just one of the worst things I ever used, for example. Now, this all said, I have a particularly blessed one for Pimax because I consistently get max or close to it on the rendered FOV with their headsets, and they tend to be somewhat comfy with very minimal wobbling. I have a very big head. This said, it is still worth talking about, as Pimax has boasted about reducing the weight by 300 grams versus the Crystal. I unfortunately do not have a big enough scale to personally weigh these monsters, but another YouTuber and person I know, Reinhardt, weighed both HMDs with some accessories on them, but they were the same ones, and the claim appears to check out. He let me use the pictures here. And you can feel it on your head. It could partially be my head shape, as the original Crystal stock strap could not go far down enough on my head to wear it right, without some comfort mods at least. But when talking stock versus stock, the Light is a step up from the original in longer sessions. There's not as much inertia swinging your head around, and the longer strap lets you get a better fit on bigger heads because it goes back a little further. You might think it'd feel more front heavy than the Crystal given the lack of the counterweight on the back, but given 250 of the 300 grams have been reduced on the front, it's not so bad. This is still on the heavier side versus current headsets, but it's not like double the weight now. The D-Mass does add weight, but it's on the sides and not so much, so I doubt you'll feel it. At least stock, it can still end up feeling like there's pressure on the face in longer sessions, but I'm talking like an hour and a half to 2 hour mark, at least for me. That said, I have run a bunch of comfort mods on this thing, as you saw when I brought it out, because there's always room to improve, and I gonna test them since I have them. I do find my absolutely tricked out OG crystal here with the $100 worth of comfort mods better than the stock light, and it should be better for that, but the light you need so much less to make it comparable in comfort. I only found a replacement face strap and top strap super important. Just like the big crystal here, I can use the light for hours without discomfort now. I've got another video covering accessories on the original crystal, and most of what I said applies to the light. Bear in mind the Pimax top strap doesn't play too nicely with the light unless you rip the Velcro off of it. And now we are at performance. I've done many videos on the crystal's performance, and I do mean many. Virtually all of them are applicable to the light, so go watch those if you want a more in-depth look. Spoilers, you're gonna need a top-end GPU to really make the most out of this. But there are two notable things I have to talk about here. While performance is identical on both the light and the crystal when running normally at native res, the light does not have eye tracking, but it does have an upscale mode. So let's talk about a bit about the foveated rendering first. If you followed me, you know that I'm a big proponent of DFR. I've done multiple videos on it and consistently praise it as one of my favorite features. Concerning Pimax's native VRS-based injection of it, you still do have fixed foveated rendering. Now, on paper, you can foveate FFR to be as aggressive as you want and get identical gains with DFR. The problem with this is that it sacrifices image quality more, as given how amazingly clear the crystal's lenses are, using FFR tends to be a lot more noticeable at higher settings. I generally stick with quality or balanced, whereas with DFR, I'm usually on balanced or performance, as Pimax has made their DFR usage even more aggressive to compensate for having eye tracking on the OG crystal here. But performance-wise, in most games, you can use lower settings and you'll still benefit greatly from it, especially as pushing more aggressive settings can be very game dependent. Some get super bad artifacts, even on conservative settings, which make using DFR at all hard. I talked about in depth in my other videos, but most of the time there is not that significant a gap between even the most conservative and most aggressive DFR. Maybe you'll get yourself another 10 to 15%-ish at best, which is nice, but it's unlikely to make or break you. You also can't use this feature if you're on an AMD GPU, as this is NVIDIA only, since AMD just physically lacks support for this method with DFR and how it's done with DirectX 11 titles, which is most VR games. Not Pimax's fault. Can use it with certain DX12 titles, though, with the OpenXR toolkit if the game supports OXR, though. Same as NVIDIA. The exception to this is quad views, which Pimax has recently added native support for when that can have much more meaningful gains. And AMD can use it just fine in titles which support it, but those titles are quite few, and I think it's only around 5 to 6 games. So FFR or DFR, it's nice, but it's unless you religiously play those, eye tracking's not going to be a huge loss or selling point. At full native res, you're really going to want a 4080 or better for most games. Depending on what you play, you may still need to compromise even with those beefy cards. But unless you exclusively play the most demanding games, such as, say, flat to VR mods or MSFS, you should be able to hold higher settings in FPS without sacrificing that much. One of the first things I'd suggest is to turn down AA, though, as MSAA times 4 can cut your performance in half at full resolution. For those with a lesser GPU, the Crystal Light also has an upscale feature, which is supposedly coming to the original Crystal at a future date. It only works at 90 Hz right now since it is in beta, but I'm gonna have a dedicated video looking at that soon since Pimax has mentioned a couple fixes are coming to it I want to wait for before I give my comprehensive thoughts on performance and image quality. But as a brief teaser, here's a quick test I ran in Pavlov at native, 90 Hz, and then downsampling native to the same output resolution as the upscaler. I was extremely Hz limited, and this is just one game, but the 1% low saw a crazy 40% improvement, so that is meaningful. Just downsampling native res had the same performance here though, so that's something I want to examine in more depth in a dedicated video. Look forward to it. I'll probably take a look at this on my 3080 Ti laptop instead of my 4090, because that's something which could actually use the upscaling mode. And we're almost done. Last major thing to talk about is the tracking and the controllers, which are identical on the Crystal Light and the OG Crystal. And besides two notable exceptions, I found these to be really good. Not quite Quest 2 or Quest 3 level, but it's so close. I almost never felt limited by the tracking or like I had to play around its limits. In stuff like Blade and Sorcery, while messing around, it always felt good, and not once did I have tracking loss or issues during fighting. I'm not a Beat Saber player, but at least felt like the light's tracking is responsive and deals with fast movement the best, like with this little spot where I raise my hand from completely at my sides, which tends to be a weakness for Inside Out, so you get people with that T-Rex arms-like pose. And I tried to raise my hands as fast as possible to grab incoming fireballs, and it worked like a charm every time. But not everything is wonderful. Play space memory in particular is awful, and I ended up with something like this every time I booted up the light. An app like OVR Advanced Settings or FPS VR to reset your floor height is mandatory with the inside-out tracking. But those are paid apps, even if cheap, so this is an area I hope Pimax can fix. If I didn't have these, needing to reset my play space, even if it's very quick in the headset with a Quest 2-like setup of drawing the controllers or selecting a boundary, it'd be almost a deal breaker. The other problem is not that major, but when it comes to occlusion from things like aiming down the sights with a gun in an FPS, it has some issues. There's not significant wobble, and for short to medium length shots like the environment I'm showing right now, I didn't feel any issues with the tracking in a near hour-long session, going back and forth between virtual stock and not having it too. It even largely felt good. But if you look here, you can see there's some wobbling while I'm aiming that's just not my shaky hands, as this was with virtual stock disabled. When making super long distance shots, say like with a sniper rifle, that becomes a significant problem. If you're not spending more than a couple seconds lining up your shot, it's okay. But after that, you'll start to be noticeably affected by the drift and have to fight it. It's not bad enough that I would call it unusable or say I'd have a bad time, but I could see myself missing a few vital shots or dying sometimes because of it. In my testing, it appears like the closer you hold the guns to your face, the worse the tracking becomes. So for guns where maybe you hold it a little further out, you could do better, and in some testing I have noticed certain weapons felt better or worse than others because of this. So rapid movements, the light deals with super well, but very slow, precise motions, it's not as great on. You can buy a Lighthouse faceplate if you want to use base station tracking though, but that's another $200 before taxes. If you don't already own base stations and have to buy those plus controllers, it gets very costly very fast, which takes away from the kinda decent price point, but it's an option. And one final brief note before we get to the conclusion. I mentioned it across the review, but let's just have a little roundup of Pimax's software. I personally have tended to avoid most of the issues people complain about, so I like it. But I've also been using their software for over 3 years. And especially this year, Pimax has made some pretty massive strides on their software end in responding to user requests. They've made the local dimming value a slider, it didn't used to be. They've finally added native quad views and OpenXR support. Pimax has really stepped up tremendously after software was such a glaring weakness for them for so long. If you're an enthusiast, Pimax software gives you some of the most extensive control within the client itself and not needing to use debug tools or go outside the client. This lets you adjust things like individual color channels, software IPD, render resolution in 100th increments. Most of these you're not going to need to adjust, and they have presets for a good chunk of them. But the options exist if you want to. I may have an unpopular opinion, but I like Pimax's software with all the things you can do with it. I've managed to generally have a good experience with it. It's my favorite I've used short of a SteamVR native HMD, and this still has some benefits over that. I know that's probably a nuclear take. Some people have had a lot of stability issues though, and you'll definitely get the most out of this as a tinkerer who doesn't mind some troubleshooting. But compared to the PyTool days, Pimax has done a great job of making things just work and be more intuitive compared to, say, a year or two ago. But I'm not going to downplay there's still room for improvement based on the community reports. I have definitely known a few people who had some major headaches with this, even somewhat recently. So, this all said, let's talk about some takeaways, namely the value proposition if the light is worth it. The Crystal Light comes in 2 main SKUs, which is a version without local dimming for $700, then one with LD for $900. I'm going to be focusing on the price point for that one with local dimming, as the one without it has been pushed back pretty far. The Crystal Light is all about clarity, and on that front, it absolutely delivers. It's not like a year and a half ago where the Crystal's clarity had little competition even in the high end though. There are a couple headsets which can come kind of close or even exceed the Crystal now, but most of those are much more expensive and not out yet, like say the VR1 or the coming Crystal Super. But in the $1,000-ish or lower range, before taxes, the Crystal Light is basically unmatched on fidelity. It has amazing lenses, but they are very temperamental and hard to find that right spot, and it can ruin your experience if you can't find it. Colors and contrast ratio can get within striking distance of OLED. Things like the Quest 3, which I've also used, just cannot compete with it when it comes to the much higher pixel density and DisplayPort connection. The clarity on the Crystal Light is so high that the games start to become the limiting factor half the time versus the headset for once. And while I won't say it's future-proof with how fast the tech moves, I'll say it's forward-thinking because the raw fidelity is probably going to hold up at least well for a good bit, especially when you consider the price point. But while I just mentioned the price of the Pro, also a good bit more expensive than some of its contemporaries. Especially with how the audio is so quiet, I'd almost say an upgrade's a requirement. Things like the Quest 3, PSVR 2, or Pico 4, not counting sales, they aren't quite half the price, but they are much cheaper. You do get a much higher fidelity image that's like a generational jump, especially versus the PSVR 2. But a few $100 isn't small at this price class. This is still an enthusiast product, so should you buy this, and what kind of person would best enjoy this thing? Well, the Crystal Light is for somebody who wants the highest clarity they can get without totally breaking the bank or has already spent most of their money on a good PC, since the Crystal Light does need a lot of power behind it. I still can't call this budget, even if we use the non-local dimming version, but for the price it actually offers quite a bit. It also works best for somebody who is fine with some tinkering and troubleshooting on their own, as while Pimax just works better than it does in the far past, getting an ideal experience can take some trial and error, like with the lenses, which sound like maybe there's some QC issues, so I'm not quite sure I'd call this fully plug and play yet, but it's getting there. Tracking's pretty good, but if you play FPS, you might need to be careful with the inside out. Nice that lighthouses are an option, though, for the best tracking on the market. Audio's a weak point 100%, but you can upgrade to some of the best audio in the whole market quite easily. But once again, that's another cost of about $100, and if you need the Lighthouse gear plus audio, then before you know it, you've almost doubled your purchase. Everything else is decent FOV, decent comfort without mods, decent-ish microphone. Overall, I think the Lite is a pretty good headset and would recommend it for somebody who wants enthusiast-like clarity, but at a better price than most of the enthusiast options. But if the cons on this headset have you uncertain, perhaps just wait and see if it comes to somewhere with a better return policy, like say Amazon. And there is the review. Have you tried the Lite yourself and got anything to add for potential buyers, positive or negative? Do you disagree with some of my nuclear takes about OLED versus LCD? Leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed the video, consider sticking around and see what I do next. If not, well, thanks for stopping by anyway. And maybe I will see you again sometime in the recommendeds. Later.